Hi, I'm Mike Richter, and today we're going to be talking about crushing limiting beliefs that have a stranglehold on your finances and success in your life. So, if we can go ahead and take a look at what our limiting beliefs are and change them, we can go ahead and change our lives for the better. So, just as an overview, we'll talk about how vocabulary, examples you've got in your life, and events that happen to you all can have an effect on you, as well as create these negative self-fulfilling prophecies in your mind and ways that you can go ahead and beat those. So first off, let's talk about vocabulary. The words that you use on a day-to-day basis and the way you think influences your actions and your results. So your words also reflect your self-image. For example, if there's something that you really want to have, say a new iPhone, for example, there are different ways that people take a look at this. Say you don't have the money right now to go ahead and buy that shiny new iPhone. Now, there are two ways that you can approach that for the sake of this example. You could either say, I can't afford it, which is self-limiting. It builds a wall between you and the thing you want. Or you could say something like, how can I afford it? What are the things that I can do? What actions can I take to achieve the thing that I want? Now you can see that there are very different ways of looking at the same circumstance. You don't currently have the financial wherewithal to buy the thing that you want, but one is self-limiting. I can't afford it. It basically shuts your mind off from thinking of ways to achieve that goal. Or how can I afford it, which is very much opening up the windows of opportunity to whatever can come into your life. And one big thing about your vocabulary and the things that you say and the actions that you take show others the kind of person you are. If you're a negative Nancy, if you're constantly whining about things, that shows your character to other people. So you want to be very careful about the words that you use and the kind of self-image that you portray, not only to yourself, but to others. So we talked a little bit about vocabulary. Now let's move on to different examples you might have seen in your life that could cause those negative thoughts or the unhelpful thought patterns in your life. So examples, you might want to look at your habits and find out which influential people in your life have the same habits and beliefs. So in terms of money, I had two primary examples in my life in my childhood. My mom was always the kind of person who was scraping by, living just for survival. How do we get through this month? Really not taking a look at the long term. How can we do better in the long term, because she was so busy stuck in survival mode. So I got to see that element, and I saw some of how that was not working for my mom. And another example that I had in my youth was my grandfather, my mom's dad. And he immigrated to the States originally in the late 50s, but then again in the mid 60s. And what he had done is he went from a survival, barely making ends meet kind of living to creating a fairly middle-class lifestyle for my mother and her three brothers. So that was kind of an example of comfort. Another thing about my grandfather is he is really set on the idea of having a regular income or a regular salary, because that's what he had grown accustomed to, because he saw that as the alternative to fighting for survival. When I first retired from the military, my grandfather asked me, hey, when are you going to get another job? And I told my grandpa, hey, Grandpa, I've got enough passive income coming in that I don't have to take a job if I don't want to. And it was mind-blowing to him, because in his mind, you don't get to do that until you're 65 or older. And I asked him, well, if I could achieve that now in my 30s, is there a reason not to do that? And it caused him to really think, and I really challenged his mindset that he had been holding for 70 plus years. So those were my financial examples that I had growing up in life. But I realized in my early 20s that I had to look elsewhere for a winning example, because the fighting for survival that my mother went through, or the just enough for an element of comfort level that my grandfather had showed me, neither of those were what I was really looking for my family and for my family's future. So I had to look elsewhere for examples. So sometimes you've got examples in your life that don't quite make sense, and you may just do it because that's the way you've always done it, or that's the way your family's always done it. Let me tell you another story about a ham, right? So we've got a husband and a wife, and the wife cooks up a ham and presents it to her husband. And he says, "That's kind of interesting. Why do you cut off the ends of the ham?" And his wife says, "Well, I don't know. That's how my mom always did it." So they went on for a little bit. A few months passed, and it was Thanksgiving time. And they went to the wife's mom's house. And sure enough, the ham was presented the same way with the two ends cut off. And both of them were kind of interested in asking the mother, "Okay, so we've been doing it because you've been doing it. Why do you make the ham this way?" So the mother just said, "Well, it's the way that my mom always did it. And so I did it this way." Around Christmas time, they went and visited the grandmother, who was well up in age, and they asked her, "Okay, so we've been cooking ham this way for generations. Why did you do it?" And the grandmother looks at both of them and said, "The only reason why I cooked the ham that way was because the ham wouldn't fit in my pan if I didn't cut off the ends." So it was discovered later on that for generations they were cooking ham this way for no reason other than it was how it was done before them. So I would highly encourage you to take a look at some of the examples and the influences in your life and see if those things are working for you. And if they're inherited habits, you might want to examine why those inherited habits are there in the first place. Because it might just be a simple self-limiting belief from before, where the grandmother didn't have a pan that was big enough to cook the ham, so that's why she cut the ends off. Something to think about. Another thing that might cement self-limiting beliefs into your mind are events. We all have events that shape us in our lives. I mean, you might have a traumatic incident that happened to you that you don't want to do things a certain way because you met a really harsh failure, or maybe you want to do things a certain way because you met great success with it. Either way, these events need to be considered in their proper context. I'll give you an example of an event that really messed me up in terms of the stock market, and why for a good 10-15 years I had no faith in the stock market. So I messed up big in my mid-20s by going all in on GM stock. I noticed that GM, General Motors, their stock price had been declining significantly over time. This is before I learned how to analyze financial statements or really understand what's going on in a company. All I saw was the stock price was going down, and I was always taught to buy low and sell high. Well, I thought, hey, let me go ahead and buy GM really low. GM's been around forever. There's no way they're going to go bankrupt. And so I took $3,000 and I bought a bunch of GM stock while it was $2 or less per share. And sure enough, because I didn't do the due diligence in figuring out what was actually going on with GM to cause the stock price to go down, a good 9 months later, GM went bankrupt. They went ahead and took a government bailout, and they shed all of their obligations from the old company and created a new company, and then started a new stock symbol. So basically, all of my financial investment in GM went to nothing, and so I was out that $3,000. And that kind of soured me on the stock market as a whole. What I failed to realize at the time was the reason why I had the problem wasn't the stock market. It was my lack of financial education to understand what was going on in that company to know whether it was a good or a bad buy. Knowing now what I didn't know then, of course I wouldn't have involved myself in that stock, and I would be $3,000 probably more richer than I am now. But I paid that price, and now I've learned quite a bit, so I do not make those same mistakes. I don't hate the stock market as much as I used to, but that event really tainted my view of the stock market. So you might want to take a look at the events that happened in your life and see if there are unreasonable or irrational reasons why you are against something. And if that's the case, maybe you need to explore those kind of things. Maybe it's an emotional issue. Maybe you went through a traumatic episode. And if that's the case, you might want to go ahead and seek counseling so that you can talk yourself through that event and realize that the event does not define you, but you choose how to define yourself. Now, we talked about vocabulary, we talked about examples, we talked about different events in our lives, how they can go ahead and create self-limiting beliefs. So now that we've looked at 3 different sources for self-limiting beliefs, let's talk about how to deal with it, right? There's a 4-step process that I learned about on how to deal with these self-limiting beliefs and how to get rid of them from your lives. And in this 4-step process, it goes know, understand, separate, and proclaim. So knowing is simply discovering the root of the problem. Now, is it a vocabulary issue? Is it you had a mom that was struggling and you just learned all of your financial habits from her? Or maybe you had a traumatic episode with the stock market and now you don't want to invest ever. You got to know where your self-limiting belief is coming from before you can understand and say, look, this problem, this event, the vocabulary that I'm choosing to use to express myself and the way I'm choosing to think does not have to define me. So once you've figured out what it is that created a self-limiting belief, you can then understand elements of that event, the words that you use or that example, and begin to look at the pieces of that puzzle and find things that work for you and find things that don't. That takes us to the next step, which is separation. This is where you can take the best and leave the rest. And that's literally what you do, is you disassociate yourself from the negative self-limiting belief, because that doesn't define you. You have a choice in that matter. You can say, look, I got burned in the stock market, but that doesn't mean I have to hate stocks. That doesn't mean that stocks are a bad thing. Or just because my grandmother cooked ham by cutting both ends of the ham off doesn't mean I need to cook ham that way. You separate yourself from that. Then you proclaim. You say, look, this is my new belief, and hit it and say, look, just because I was burned in the stock market, I don't care. I will invest for my future because I know that that's what is right for me and my family. Take a stand and stand for it. You end up finding a way of creating new pathways in your mind to get your mind and your body believing what you're proclaiming, if you're willing to get out there and step up and claim it and be willing to say it out loud. So that's what we went over. We talked about how vocabulary, the things that you say, things like I can't afford it versus how can I afford it. We also talked about examples, how people in your life or different things that you've seen could have created self-limiting beliefs in your mind, and maybe you need to find out what's good and what's bad from that. We also talked about events in your life, how you could have traumatic or really awesome events that have happened in your life that could have created some of the belief structure that you hold. And finally, we talked about dealing with self-limiting beliefs and basically just crushing them and creating the life that you want by dealing with your negative self-limiting beliefs. We talked about that 4-step process of knowing, understanding, separating, and proclaiming so that you can deal with self-limiting beliefs and create the life that you want. Once again, you find out what the root of the problem is, you understand, that's basically knowing that that root doesn't have to define you. You separate yourself, you say, look, this is the good stuff that happened in this, or these are the good words that I want to associate with my life. This is the good part of this example that I had in my life, and say, look, the rest of it, I don't need that because I can't have that limiting my life. And finally, you proclaim, you establish good, self-fulfilling beliefs. You step up, you own it, you claim it, and you move on with life. So if you found this to be valuable, by all means, go ahead and click the like button down below. If you'd like to hear more from this channel, hit the subscribe button. I look forward to providing more quality content to you. If there's anything that you want to talk about, especially maybe talking about some self-limiting beliefs that you have. I've given you some of my stories. I'd love to hear some of yours. If you'd like to, go ahead and put it in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a fantastic day.